Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Iain Murray, Vice President for Strategy at CEI. Iain, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back with you, Bill.
Iain, last time we had you on, maybe a year ago, we discussed the history of the National Labor Relations Board and the evolving relationship between employees, employers, and the government. I'd like to continue in that vein today and cover two subjects. First, let's discuss some of your more recent work on the evolution of corporations as they move ever further into the so-called gig economy. And second, as a British expat, I'd like to get your views on labor regulations in the UK before and after Brexit. Let's start with The Nature of the Firm, which is the title of an influential paper written by economist Ronald Coase 80 years ago. What was so important about his original observations?
Well, Coase is a very interesting character. You know, he did all his work at the Chicago Law School because he's not a quantitative economist. He's a guy who went out and looked at what people actually did, how they actually behaved in the economy. And one of the questions he wanted to ask was, why do we have firms? Why do firms exist? Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not a question that you can really answer with calculus. He looked at it and thought, okay, if you want something done, your natural reaction is to go to a market and find somebody to do it for you, pay them, and then that's the end of it. But if you're an entrepreneur, then trying to get the same thing done day after day after day, the market doesn't quite solve that problem. And there are all sorts of costs, which he initially called marketing costs, the cost of going to market, but eventually he chose a different term, a transaction cost, that just make this process really difficult for an entrepreneur. So what the entrepreneur does instead is hire somebody to do the job for him under an employment contract rather than a commercial contract. But of course, once you employ somebody, then there are all sorts of costs that are involved with that, and those are the costs of organizing an organization. And I think what's happening today is that we're seeing Coase's fundamental observation about transaction costs is really becoming the dominant issue in the economy.
Well, I want to go forward on that, particularly as organizational costs change. But before we do, the topic that I want to inject is the thoughts that Hayek brought to the table when he looked at the information content that markets put on prices. What's that all about?
This is really important. Friedrich Hayek realized that prices convey a lot of information about all our preferences and needs and wants. All that great mass of human knowledge is summed up in the price system of how people interact with each other to get goods and services and needs and wants fulfilled. And that's really important. And of course, this combines with what Coase was saying, because he noted, because of this phenomenon of transaction costs, that the central feature of the firm is the suppression of the price mechanism.
You're not bargaining with your workers all day long, and you don't have to account for the cost of what they're doing that's absorbed in the organization.
Exactly. And so firms have got to find other ways of getting the information that's contained in the price system, because otherwise they can lose out very quickly.
Iain, you make a further observation when you put Coase and Hayek together about how these information flows need to happen and what happens when you suppress them. Fill us in on that.
Currently, there's a lot of other things that are attached to the employment contract. Regulators want a lot of other information to go into employment. Information about health preferences, information about what happens when you're made unemployed, all sorts of things like that. They've attached those to the employment contract as a sort of additional piece of information. What's happening is that regulation is, intentionally or not, and I think it is intentional, forcing firms to become bigger and bigger. For instance, there's an attack on the franchising movement at the moment. There's an attack on contracting out of services. This is all part of what the Wages and Hours administrator at the Department of Labor, a guy called David Weil, who used to be a professor at a management school up in Boston, and what he calls the fissured workplace. He thinks that the firm is broken down and needs to be put back together again. Of course, the reason why it broke down was because firms were seeking that information that's contained in the price system.
Well, there seems to be a rearguard action going on. I mean, Coase was writing at a time when the Second Industrial Revolution had given way to the Great Depression, And during that time, and up until the dawn of the information age, scale and access to capital and stability were the primary determinants of industrial success. How has that changed in our modern information age?
Well, as there's more information out there, it's become more important to get that information. So firms have reacted by instituting new business practices. The change from personnel management to human resources management was very much part of this move, trying to get more information about how your employees can benefit the company from their own particular skills. That you don't just hire one set of skills when you hire an employee, you hire a lot of other skills as well. And so human resources was really an effort to capture that information. Similarly, other new business practices sprang up, like contracting out non-essential services. Why do you really need to employ a cleaner for 8 hours a day when they're only coming in right at the end of the day?
Right.
So let's contract out that service to somebody else. And franchising was another way of building innovation into the system, saying to people who would otherwise be managers of individual stores or restaurants, saying, you're going to be the owner of this restaurant. It's all on you. You can innovate to your heart's content as long as you use certain basic branding practices. That's how McDonald's got the Big Mac. That was invented in a franchise. It wasn't invented by corporate McDonald's.
Well, this extends to the consumer side, too. Look at the difference in information flow between hailing a 1930s-style cab and then telling the driver where you want to go, and Uber.
That's exactly it. You've now got to the stage where you actually know where the cars are. And that's just such an amazing advantage and step forward.
And they know where you want to go, and you have surge pricing, so you know when there are shortages and there are surpluses, which makes sure you can always get one in the rain. It's a completely different world.
It is. The amount of information that our systems can now convey to us about our transactions is quite astonishing. And that's why transaction costs are the dominant feature of this new economy. There's so much more information in a transaction than in an organization that I think we're seeing a move further away from the large corporation, or at least that's the way the economics is pushing us, further away from the large corporation than back towards it, which is where the regulation is pushing us.
Which, of course, takes powers away from unions and the government if we go into smaller and smaller firms.
That's exactly it. Rational innovation, which is what is happening as a result of these economic and information changes, that's not what they want. They want to attach certain conditions to things, like contraceptive coverage for all, that convey information about an ideal society, a utopian society. And so regulation of the large corporation that has little competition is the easiest way to deliver those conditions. But innovation is really the enemy of that system.
Iain, I'd like to use the remainder of our time to get a post-Brexit analysis from you today. We discussed that with our other two guests. Is leaving the EU a disaster or an opportunity for England?
Well, it could be both. It really is a huge opportunity to press a reset button. But if they get things wrong, then it could be a real disaster. It's a difference between an open Britain that's open for business and one that shuts up shop. And if it shuts up shop, then that could be a real disaster.
Do you have any confidence that this new prime minister might choose the right path?
What she's done so far is very encouraging. She's appointed the people who are really in favor of Brexit to carry it out. And those people are free market, classical liberal Thatcherite types. So hopefully they're going to get that direction right.
There was a lot of hawkish rhetoric spilled prior to the Brexit referendum by bureaucrats and even Obama, trying to scare voters into remaining in the EU. Now that the deal is done, do you expect rational transition negotiations, or will EU bureaucrats be more focused on making an example out of England to keep the other member countries in line?
I'm glad you mentioned Obama. Obama's visit to the UK when he said that Britain would have to go to the back of the queue, not the line, for trade deals. That, according to the pollsters, that produced a 3-point swing. So Obama's visit might actually have tipped the referendum in favor of leave. What we're seeing here, I think, is a classic prisoner's dilemma, that both sides really have every incentive to be nasty to each other. The EU has very good reasons to be vindictive towards Britain. They don't want any more countries to leave. Italy's on the verge of moving to being a majority Eurosceptic nation. And a new Eurosceptic government could push for what some people are starting to call Quitaly.
Quiddly.
And, of course, France, the autarkic party in France, is gaining hand over fist in elections as well. So the EU has every reason to be vindictive and try and stop Britain from leaving.
But then again, the Germans sell a lot of cars in the UK.
They do indeed. In fact, a fifth of German car exports go to the UK, and that's their national champion industry. So there's a lot of reason why they should be rational as well. And if both sides are rational, I think that we could come to a very beneficial deal on both sides.
Trade relations aside, what's the most important thing England can do within its own borders to remove or reform the tens of thousands of regulations heaped on them by the EU?
Well, I think this is where an idea by our Competitive Enterprise Institute colleague Wayne Cruz could really be very helpful, which is to establish a commission, or in Britain I suppose it would be a royal commission, on regulatory reduction, and just get the government to send them all the tens of thousands of regulations that the EU has asked them to impose on British business, and indeed to add the tens and thousands of regulations that British civil servants have gold-plated those regulations with. Get them to send them all to this commission and set the commission to work. Take that out of Parliament, depoliticize the process, and the commission send a recommendation to Parliament that these regulations be repealed, these regulations be reformed, and these regulations should stay. I think that's the only really feasible way that the UK can deal with this absolute mountain of regulations. And
it'd be like an up or down vote, the way they did with the base closing commissions here in the U.S.?
Yes, when legislation is needed. One of the things about the British regulatory system is that you don't always need legislation to revoke a regulation. So it could be that the Commission could just send a list of recommendations to the House of Commons, and the House of Commons, if it doesn't act, those regulations would be repealed automatically.
Well, I wish we had some of that here. The EU manages a giant price-fixing system across member countries, particularly in the area of farm policy. How will Brexit benefit British consumers? And will British farmers thrive without protections, or will they be unable to compete?
Well, I think if you look at the market prices of food in the European Union compared with the rest of the world, the European Union is basically a price-fixing scheme, as you say, that has raised food prices, agricultural prices, by about 17% over the world market. Just simply being able to turn to other places outside the common agricultural policy, developing world nations and so on, for agricultural resources, I think that's going to be a huge benefit in terms of just reducing food prices. As for the farms, here, Britain has got a really good example in another Commonwealth country of New Zealand, which just got rid of its agricultural subsidies essentially overnight. And we've seen the agricultural industry there just thrive. They've specialized in certain things. Milk production's up. New Zealand lamb is some of the best in the world. Number of lambs birthed and exported is way up. And that's all after the abolition of the subsidies that the farmers said that they couldn't survive without.
Well, they did a tremendous job in New Zealand with both their farms and their fisheries. And I think now the biggest supporters of free markets there are farmers and fishermen.
Yes, this would not surprise me, especially as the fishermen were given an actual property right in their fish. They didn't have to worry about artificial quotas and so on. They were given a property right in their fisheries. Right. And of course, that's also seen, and I think the environmental groups that have studied this really recognize this. The fish stocks around New Zealand have recovered and are now exploding.
There's been a lot of talk about a new trade union amongst the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and maybe even the US. Basically a league of English-speaking peoples. Is anything likely to come of that?
Well, I think it's very likely to be the first step in Britain's new trading relationship with the rest of the world. Canada, New Zealand, and Australia have already said they want to do very quick trade deals with the UK. So all you need to do is get them around a table and agree on sort of mutual standards, and you could get that signed very quickly. And of course, there's been a long tradition up until recently of essentially free labor mobility between those countries as well. That could come back quite quickly. But I think that's just the start. The US has always been the sort of detached cousin of the Anglosphere, but I can see a US-UK trade deal happening quite quickly. There's already a bill in Congress for that. But as I say, I think that's the first step. My friend Dr. John Holtzman, who used to be at the Heritage Foundation, has a proposal for a global free trade alliance, which would be a rules-based alliance. It wouldn't be a treaty, it'd be an alliance. Basically, if you meet the rules, you're in. And I think that GFTA could easily start off with Canada, New Zealand, UK, Australia, CANZUK as they call it, CANZUK alliance.
London is one of the foremost financial centers of the world, and members of the finance industry apparently overwhelmingly wanted to remain in the EU. Does London risk losing its primacy?
This was obviously a huge concern, but when you look at the way that European financial regulation works, I don't think it should be as big a concern as it perhaps was. A lot of financial regulation is actually set at the global level. And so, for instance, things like the Basel Accords are being implemented by the EU and US and other countries all at the same time. So that's all basically dealt with at a level beyond the EU. There's a lot of other stuff that the EU is implementing, which is essentially just implementation of global agreements. In the end, the British financial regulatory system won't look that much different from the EU's. And the EU has a principle called passporting, which allows other countries access to its financial markets if they have a regulatory equivalence. And I think it's very clear that Britain's regulatory system will be viewed as equivalent to the EU's, so that banks can get passports very quickly. And then, of course, there's also the question of the EU's capacity for finance.
Right.
There isn't much of a financial industry. Yeah, there are banks, yes, but the other financial services, they don't really exist outside of the UK and Switzerland in Europe. So the EU will probably remain reliant on British financial services for a very long time to come.
Well, Iain, it's interesting to get an update from you. We'll see how this Brexit rolls out, and we'll be back with you in a year to check in again. Thanks for coming on the show.
Always a pleasure.
That was Iain Murray, Vice President for Strategy at CEI, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, which the New York Times has called an invaluable tool for anyone interested in politics or public affairs. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on iTunes or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. Ahead, we'll speak with Mercatus Center's Richard Williams, former Director for Social Sciences at the FDA. Stay tuned.